economists. You might say, how could economists not see the housing bubble? Economists are no better at predicting future fads than meteorologists are at predicting the weather next year, or physicists are at predicting where I'll be in 2 weeks. Economists are very, very good at knowing if the price of wheat goes up now, here's what will happen tomorrow. And they're very good at some long-term forecasting too. But knowing what will happen in the long run in a housing market turns out to be very complicated. One reason it's complicated is that people are not just buying houses to live in them. They're buying houses as an investment. They're buying houses because they're afraid that if they don't buy a house, the house will go up in value and they won't be able to afford the same house later on. They are, in a sense, speculating in housing even as they're also living in it. It's very tricky to figure out people's speculation because it's about their psychology of everyone thinking prices are going up, I better buy now. And that's what we mean by a bubble. We mean that people are afraid to stay out of the market because they're afraid prices will rise. So they buy the item in question, or they see everyone else making money, they think I'll make money too. But then the price ends up having little to do with their actual demand for the product, that is their actual preference for it, and certainly has very little to do with the actual cost of assembling the inputs. Some people have faith that governments can intervene and control these bubbles. You know, in the housing case, the government did not see the bubble coming any more than the private market saw it coming. So there's a lot of disagreement there among economists about whether governments are part of the problem or part of the solution in bubbles. Again, though, that's something you need to study in the future because we can't afford too many bubbles in your lifetime. A couple Thanksgivings ago, I was sitting on a packed airplane. I was lucky enough to have an aisle seat. Sitting next to me was a really nice, tall, very tall student named Todd, and we chatted a little bit. And he asked me, listen, how about trading seats with me for $50? You know, I'm a really big guy. I'm 6'8". These middle seats cramp me. I really, really want an aisle seat. So every time I get on a plane, I'm in a middle seat, I try to bargain with the person next to me to get the aisle seat so I can stretch out my legs. $50? I said, sure. Now think about Todd a little bit and the study of economics. We saw that economics is about the allocation of scarce resources. Well, the scarce resource is the aisle seat. There are fewer aisle seats than people who want them. Now, also, there's no market. Todd wishes there had been a big market out there where you got on the plane or you got on your computer and you saw which seats were available and which seat you want and you could bid for your seat. Todd apparently was willing to pay $50 to get an aisle seat. But at least so far, no airline is saying, oh, you can move to the aisle seat if you give me $47.80. So Todd was trying to create the market on his own. Of course, it's a complicated market. In a sense, he had to create two markets. He had to sell his middle seat and buy an aisle seat. Now, people do that on Wall Street, and they make hundreds of millions of dollars. On Wall Street, we call it arbitrage. They look for things that they think are mispriced, where you can make money by selling one thing and buying another thing, and maybe doing them backwards and forwards many, many times in a day. That's in a way what Todd was trying to do, except he didn't have a well-developed market. Todd wished there had been these markets, but instead he had to make them. He was trying to arbitrage middle seats and aisle seats. So we've been talking about cookies and about houses, and they are sold in competitive markets. By competitive markets, I don't mean anything complicated. Just that there are many buyers and sellers running around trying to service one another, get the business, buy the thing at a lower price, and all that. Those markets are the foundation of economics. Economists spend a lot of time on competitive markets. But not everything is sold in a competitive market, and maybe less so than ever. For example, nonprofits occupy the healthcare field. Nonprofits are important in education. Nonprofits are important in supplying goods to poor people and so forth. Governments are not competitive firms. They're either monopolists or something else. Governments supply a lot. They supply national defense and firefighting and national parks and schools and this and that. And then there are also monopolists. Monopolists, again, are single sellers traditionally. They have a market all to themselves. Think about all the monopolists that we know. iPads are sold in monopoly markets because Apple has patents on critical aspects of the iPad. Let's examine those prices and messenger systems a little bit more carefully by thinking at the same time of an example where the airline is now not a competitor, where many, many airlines are flying. But let's now begin to introduce the idea of the monopolist, that is the seller who does not face competition, but is the only one selling these seats. Let's try an example together. Do you remember Todd on the airplane? Imagine that Todd was flying on a plane, and to make the example as simple as possible, imagine the plane was owned by an airline called Big Air, for lack of a better name, and that Big Air was the only carrier flying between the two cities Todd and I were traveling. Say it was Boston to LaGuardia Airport in New York. So I have a chart here. I've, of course, made it up, but it's a pretty realistic chart in a way. And it shows that as Big Air charges more and more for a seat on the airline, fewer people will want to travel on Big Air. Either they won't travel to New York, or they'll drive, take the train, walk, donkey, what have you. But let's have a look at it. If they charge $50 a seat, 10,000 people will want to fly to New York that day. Wow. If they charge $5,000 a seat, basically no one wants to go. 10 spoiled snobs will fly. And there you go on the bottom. $5,000 price, 10 seats. Big Air will collect $50,000. And then in the more realistic range, at a price of $300, we see that 2,000 people will demand seats, that is, want to accept the offer to travel from Boston to New York on Big Air at that price on that day. And so if it sells 2,000 tickets at $300 each, Big Air will collect $600,000 in revenue. I haven't said anything about their costs yet. If it raises the price more to $500, well, it gets a lot of people. 1,000 of those 2,000 people will still want to pay for the seat, and they'll pay $500, but of course 1,000 people will then not fly. So I've constructed the example so that Big Air takes in the most money when it charges $300. It's not free for Big Air to fly to New York. It has costs. And as we know, these costs are very, very important in figuring out when to fly, how to fly, and what to charge. I think of Big Air charging just $50, that sort of crazy low price. 10,000 people wanting to travel. We know that Big Air would have taken in $500,000 in revenue. Well, what does it cost Big Air to fly 10,000 people? And I've put in some huge number. Imagine that it costs an average of $300 a person, which would be $3 million to fly so many people. Why does it cost more rather than less per seat when it wants to fly more and more people? Well, to a degree, when you start increasing the number of seats, that is, you increase production or output as we call it, to a degree, costs drop. Think about the pilot flying the plane. If you only have one passenger on the plane and you've got to pay the pilot, say, $1,000 a day to fly the plane, then that $1,000 is borne entirely by that one customer sitting in seat 1A. You put 10 customers on the plane, same pilot, the pilot's salary can now be spread among 10 customers. So that relatively fixed cost of the pilot, that fixed cost drops, or it becomes a less important part of price as we have more and more customers. When Big Air increases the number of passengers from 10 to 1,000 by dropping the price from 5,000 to 500, it gets what we sometimes call economies of scale. It's able to